Hello, this is Jeremy Tyrrell from UNC Wilmington. And in this tutorial, we're going to look at mapping outgoing students, so placement of alumni from a particular program. In particular, we're going to be looking at major students, but this could be done with other populations, graduate students, and so forth. As always, if you have any questions about this, feel free to contact me using the information on my website, jtyrrell.com. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So the purpose here, primarily we're looking at, I would think, external use for recruitment purposes. This will demonstrate geographical distribution, where students are being placed physically, and it'll also provide information about industry and graduation year. So this does sort of demonstrate the places you can go and the things you can do. Internally, there will be use as well to demonstrate the geographical scope of your program. Potentially that could be a broad distribution, or it could be locally focused. And as we've discussed before, neither is inherently positive or negative. It has to do with the goals of your program and your institution. You know, if you want to demonstrate something like serving a local population, you can do that. If you want to demonstrate your ability as a program to place students quite literally anywhere, then you can do that as well if the data reflects that. And that works both domestically and internationally. Okay, so what we're actually going to be producing, primarily these things are going to be useful as interactive visualizations. We're going to be using some tools like Google Maps and Google Fusion tables, where in order to get access to the data, interactivity is rather required. You know, particularly for things like maps with place markers, a lot of data is going to be embedded in those things that only emerges through interaction. We will have the ability to create static images for print or for electronic distribution. When we say print images, primarily we're talking about just stills. The only real difference here is resolution. If we're talking about actual print resolution, 300 dpi or thereabouts, or screen resolution, basically we'll have the ability to have print resolution stills because we're going to be ostensibly printing from Google Maps, which will render it out at print resolution. The visualizations we'll create from Fusion tables are technically not maps, they're just visualizations, but they can be exported in usable formats. So the collection of data is going to, actually, the data we're using is going to result from the survey form we've already covered. Oops, let me back up there. So this is another visualization that is possible with the survey form that we created in a previous tutorial. If you haven't looked at that tutorial, you might do that because we're creating multiple visualizations from the same survey data. As I mentioned, the tools we're using, Google Sheets, that's going to be the source of our information because the sheet we'll use is linked to a Google form. Those two things work in tandem. Then we'll be pulling that data into Google Maps once we've treated it in Sheets because we have to do a little bit of data handling there. We'll also then pull it into Google Fusion tables, which is something people are less familiar with than Google Maps. It's a really powerful tool to treat data, to handle data, and then also to do different kinds of visualization. And principally what it's useful for is combining different kinds of data, hence the fusion in that title. We probably won't be doing that. We could, but we're not going to be covering that. Probably what we'd be using it for is fusing in another table that would correspond to different kinds of place marks. We're probably not going to be doing that because most of that functionality can be handled through Google Maps itself. All right, anyway, so just sort of looking at some of the things we're going to produce, let me just pull up some examples of those. So this, oops, wrong one. So this, for example, would be an example of a feature map. This comes from Google Maps. So this is a static image of that. You can see place mark distribution, one thing about using a place mark map or a feature map, icons that are at the same location or quite close become, whoops, a little bit ambiguous because they get clustered, and unless you zoom in, they don't disambiguate. This is a still, so they're not going to do that. You know, in the maps program itself, these will spread out a little bit as you zoom in, because we're just zooming in on a still. That's not super, it's not going to do that. So this isn't super useful for that purpose. That said, something like this still heat map, this does have pretty much the same utility, because with a heat map, we're not looking really at individual place marks. We're looking at areas. So you wouldn't be able to get interactive data from this heat map anyway. So these are some examples of stills. If we look at these as interactive maps, and let me just pull something like that up for you. Just close this out. So this is the interactive. This is an actual Google map, and you can see when we click on these place marks, it gives us particular information. Right now, these are categorized by industry, although you certainly could change that, and we'll go over how to do that here in a bit. But notice that these clusters here, if we zoom in on the actual map, it will disambiguate those by spreading those out. See, now we can see they're actually in different areas. On the still, that's not going to happen because we're just zooming in closer, right? We're just making the still larger. So this is a demonstration of how interactivity, particularly for a place mark map, it's really helpful, because now we can actually click these things and that embedded data comes to the fore. Okay, so that's that. So let's look at actually producing these things. I'm going to go ahead and pull up. You can see here we have the, this is just the top level of my drive. Pay no attention to all the other stuff. We have the form that we produced in a previous tutorial. And this is it in its editable state. This is what it looks like live. I don't believe I covered that in the previous tutorial, but I did change the theme, which you can do here, which with this change theme button. This is the default, but I just used this one that has books, since this is, you know, for English department. Might as well use a little visual reinforcement there. And that form, of course, corresponds with a Google Sheet. This is what that looks like. So we've got our raw responses here, and in some previous tutorials, I think it was just one where we did both industry data and salary data, where we produced some corresponding charts. And we made separate sheets within that workbook for these. We're going to continue that pattern when we look at map data, because our raw responses here, as we've discussed, there's going to be continual additions to these rows here, right? Every new response to that form is just going to pile up here. So you don't want to start tinkering and moving this data because it's still fluid. And also in this sheet, there's different kinds of data columns here, right? So for example, in salary data, we only want to deal with a couple of columns. The same thing's true with industry, really just the one column. With this map data, we're going to be dealing with a few columns, but not all of them. Certainly not something like email, but we are going to deal with graduation years, the first name, not the last name. That's really for internal use only. This column we won't be presenting, but we are going to need it, because although all the location data in terms of city and state is collected in this one column, in order to make that more specific on the map, we're going to need either the name of the employer or the institution. And that's going to depend on if the person responding is working or furthering his or her education, right? It's two separate columns because of the way our form is set up. Depending on the response to this question, the person is only going to get a different set of questions having to do with industry and salary, or institution and degree. If the person has no response, then he or she doesn't get any of those questions. All that's to say, we're going to have to use in our map worksheet some conditional statements. So we're going to have to use some functions. If you haven't used those before, we'll walk through it. It can look a little intimidating just because it uses some if-then logic, some conditional logic. But the Google Sheets program or service, it prompts you as you go. So it really sort of walks you through how to handle these kinds of things. Another thing I should point out is that this worksheet is shared. So let me just, it's actually on the information for this video. So if you're watching this video, if you just look at the description there, the link is in that window. Let me just show you that here really quickly. This is our link. It's shortened, so you can just go there. Again, this is there below in the description for this video, and this will take you to this spreadsheet that we're going to be generating, or that we're generating as we go here. And it's shared, so you can go ahead and just take a copy of that, and it'll have all these functions embedded in it, just so you can actually get a copy of this rather than just sort of follow along. I realize it can be a little difficult to follow along as we go. So you can get a copy of this worksheet through this URL, and then all these functions will be there for you. So I'm going to remove this, but do keep in mind this information is in the description for this this tutorial, this video. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to go ahead and make a sheet here, and by default, it's going to move it over here to the right. I'm just going to call this map data, in keeping with the naming structure we're already using for our other sheets. Now, as we've discussed, I want to go ahead and move this all the way to the left. And this isn't simply for organizational purposes. When we load this worksheet in Google Maps, it's only going to look for the first sheet. It doesn't load the entire book. It looks for the first sheet. So if this data is anywhere else, it's not going to find it. It's less of an issue with Fusion tables, but with Google Maps, it's only going to look for the first worksheet. Now, there are a couple ways around this. For example, you could just spit this out as a CSV, a comma-separated value chart. In fact, I usually recommend that because it just keeps things nice and tidy, and there's no ambiguity about what's being loaded. But that is an extra step, so we'll look at it in both ways. But it's just also good practice to make sure you're doing these things so that if you load it in Google Maps and it doesn't pull up the data, you know exactly what's happening there. Okay, if I don't have this tab in the right place, it's not going to do it. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to go ahead and set up my my header row right now, because I want us to start thinking about what columns we actually want. For this worksheet, in contrast to some of the other worksheets we've set up, we're going to be dealing with multiple columns, and they're going to be pulling data from different places. It's not just one column, and they're not going to be in order because we want to set this thing up in a logical way. So it's going to be pulling data from all over this raw responses worksheet. So here's the order I want stuff in. You can deviate from this, but this is what we're going to use for this example. I want the actual institution first. And the institution is either going to be the place where the respondent is working, or the university or educational institution, because some of these folks will be going to other institutions that may not fall under the aegis of graduate school or whatever. But all of these things are institutions, right? Place the person is working, the place the person is going to school or furthering his or her education. Then I want what I'm going to call location, and that'll be just the city and state that the respondent inputs here in the on the form that corresponds with this worksheet. As much as possible, I'm going to try and use the same nomenclature that's used here in the raw responses worksheet. It's not going to be possible for every column because for example, institution, that's going to or cover both the name of the employer and the name of the educational institution. So I've got industry, location. I'm going to call this name, and it's just going to be the first name. I'm not going to call it first name because it's going to be the name of the person that is used. So we're not going to have last name at all. So putting first name would be a little confusing to people. Also, it's going to be used in the map as a label, and because of that, if it was just first name, or if it was first name, that'd be a little confusing because it would suggest that last name is there somewhere. It's not. Name is going to just cover first name. So that's what we're going to use as the header. I do want graduation year, and that should be that should reflect, how it's used here in raw responses. And I want the industry as well. And now again, like location, industry is either going to be the actual industry if the person is working, but, and this is going to be a little quirky, if the person is going to an educational institution, if they're furthering their education, then all of those are going to fall under the industry of graduate education. Remember, that's what we did when we were making the chart for industry. Every different educational institution just fell under the label of graduate education. That's what we're going to be doing here, but because they're pulling from different places, we're going to have to use a conditional statement to make that work. That's everything we're going to be doing right now. We're going to add one more column a little bit later, but we'll talk about that when we get there. Oh, another thing I should point out, I don't think I mentioned this in the previous tutorial. Here under raw responses, we do have the timestamp column here. I've hidden that. All that reports is when it came in, so you can see it's a date and a time. It's only for these first four because I used the form itself to submit those. These others I just generated manually. I a lot of times will just hide that column. I don't delete it, of course, but I just click hide because I don't usually need that column, and it just becomes just sort of a superfluous data. So that's just to say, if you probably have that column there, I just hide it, but it can be exposed. Okay, so we've got our headers, our row headers, or our column headers, I'm sorry. I am going to go ahead and freeze my first row here, just so that this functions as a header. Now it's time to move the data over. Now in these other worksheets, it was basically just copy and paste. We're just copying and pasting values. Now, in theory, you could do that here, right? We could just copy the location data. Excuse me, we could copy the first name here, the graduation year. Sorry, my voice is skipping. What we would have to do here in institution, though, is, it'd be kind of a little bit of a pain. We'd have to copy these over. I mean, in theory, what we could do is just copy this whole thing, and these blanks we could fill with these. Right? Because what we want is either the employer or the educational institution. Now, as we've talked about before, that's human focused, right? We'd have to do a lot of sort of fiddly copying and pasting. And that always introduces the possibility of error, right? Anytime that we have a human making all these sorts of little fiddly changes, there's a possibility for introduced error. And then when we dealt with this column as well, industry, we'd have to copy the industries, and then some of these blanks we would fill with graduate education, but not all of them, because these no response folks, we wouldn't put that there. So you could manually copy all this, and if you wanted to, if you're not comfortable with functions, and we'll be using conditional functions, which those are a little bit more complicated. you can go ahead and do that, but be aware that you're introducing the possibility for error. And since we're going to walk through how to use these functions, it's just better. It reduces that chance for error. It's going to collect everything. It's going to set it up in a structure that you don't have to then, every time there's new data, go through that same process. I mean, that's labor intensive. We're going to set things up using functions that you don't have to do that. It's just going to pull automatically from the raw response worksheet there. So let's start with just the sort of more simple functions, drawing data from the raw responses worksheet. So we're not using conditionals yet. All I want to do is pull the information from this location column in the raw responses worksheet into this column here. So what I'm going to do is, and you've probably done this before, I just need to tell this worksheet to go ahead and pull data from this other raw responses worksheet. So I'm going to put, or first thing I'm going to do is check the column here. It appears to be the F2, or it's the F column starting with 2 and then going all the way, through the rest of the worksheet. We don't want F1 because that's the actual header. So it starts with F2. So I'm going to go ahead and put equals. That tells the worksheet to pull from somewhere else. It's also how we start functions. I'm going to put equals, and then I'm going to put a single quotation mark because that's how you indicate a name. Since these are named worksheets, we do have to provide the name. You can also just put the sheet number, but we have names, so we should go ahead and put equals, single quotation mark, raw responses, close that single quotation mark, and then we're going to put an exclamation point, which indicates that a cell is to follow, and then F2. Now you can see the colors changed to orange. That indicates that this is that it's drawing from another place, that this is a legitimate structure. So now I can go ahead and check that manually. It's Norman, Oklahoma, the town of my birth, coincidentally. And that is correct, right? So what we want to do is just go ahead and copy this cell. I'm just going to go ahead and go down to 20 here, although that's more cells than I have data, but that's perfectly fine. And you can see we've got our cells auto-filled, and we can just make a manual check to make sure everything's okay. But of course it is. I mean, it's it's a machine. That's what it does. And you can see up here in the actual cell entry bar that it's just going through the sequence here, F10, F11, F12. It's smart enough to do that automatically. Whoops, I put this in the wrong column. I goofed this up. I want this in location rather than name. And you can see, even though I moved that, it's smart enough to retain that that structure. So it's still pulling from the location column, which I accidentally put in name here. Okay, so that's our location. Now we want only the first name here, so we'll repeat that process, but we're dealing with column C. So we'll do the same thing. Equals raw responses C2, and there's our name. We'll do a copy, and then we'll just paste. And you'll notice I went ahead and stretched farther than we have data stretching to 19. Because raw responses is going to keep growing and growing, what I would normally do is stretch this all the way down to the bottom of the sheet, 1,000 cells. That way, any new data that comes into the raw responses sheet is going to automatically be reflected here in this map data sheet. I'm not doing that right now just for demonstration purposes, but that's what I would do. Okay, so we've got our location, we've got name, graduation year, same deal. It looks like it's the B column there, so equals. B2, I believe, yes. Okay, now we have to get to our conditionals here. As I mentioned, here in institution, we couldn't just copy this over because it has to cover both people who have an employer and people who have an educational institution. So rather than do this manually and introduce the possibility of error, and right now we only have what, 18 responses, but if you did this year after year after year, you'd be getting a lot. And so having to do this manually would be a not insignificant bit of labor. So we're going to go ahead and use a function here, a conditional. It's an if, and an if-then, basically. And we're going to walk through how this works, and it's going to give you a prompt as well as we go. So I'm going to do equals, which indicates that we're going to put in a function. It's just like what we did in these other columns, except instead of drawing data, we're going to use a sort of a more sophisticated function. I'm going to write if, and you can see it pulls up returns value depending on logical expression. That's the one we're going to use. And now it gives us information about how to break this down. The gist of it is we're going to ask if something is the case, then do something else. So in our situation, that's if raw responses, so if on that page, and we're going to say column G and number 2. So if cell G2 on raw responses, that was the column where we get that collects the response if a student is working or going to school. Let me just pull that up. So see, it's G2 that has that answer. So we're going to ask if the response is I am working, do this. If it's I'm furthering my education, do that. If it's neither of those, then do something else. So if raw responses G2 is equal to I am working, then paste raw responses column H2. Yeah, and that formula isn't closed yet. I just want to show you, yeah, there is a problem. I'm aware of that. If the person is saying in their raw responses, I am working, then go ahead and put where they are working, which is found here in H2. If the person is saying I'm furthering my education, then we want to put what's in K2, the institution. So let's go ahead and hook that up. And because I didn't close my formula, it went ahead and undid that. If there's a problem in the formula, it'll let you know. So I am working. Please go ahead and pull from raw responses H2. Oh, whoops. Raw responses H2. If, and you can nest one if inside of another because there are two remaining options, right? That the person is going to school or the person has no response. So I need a nested if inside of this first if. If raw responses G2, so if that same question, if the person's reply is I am furthering my education. Ordinarily, also, I would copy and paste these rather than just type them out because then you know it's exactly as written. If you make a mistake here, it won't work out, and you'll be frustrated trying to figure out, hey, what's the problem here when it could just be a typo. Those are maddening accidents. So if the person answers this, I am furthering my education, then put whatever is in raw responses K2, right? That's the educational institution. And now we just have to close this out because all we're doing is asking, hey, if in raw responses G2 the person is saying I am working, then please go ahead and put what's in H2. If the person responds I'm furthering my education, please go ahead and put what's in K2. That's all we're saying. And then we just close this, close both of them, which we do with these close quotation marks and then parentheses. So we don't have to make an if statement for if they put no response, right? Because if they don't put I am working or I am furthering my education, it has to be no response, right? If there were 4 options there, we'd have to put an even further if statement. Just keep nesting and nesting until we've hit all our options, or all -1, because then we know if they haven't done the other options, it has to be that last one. Okay, so you can see the result of what we've done right here. If Bill in Norman, Oklahoma has responded, I am working, then please go ahead and put where he's working. And that should be correct, right? Bill said, I'm working, and it put that. Now, our second person here, Sally, she's furthering her education. So hopefully, if we've hooked everything up right, it's going to know she's responded that, and it's going to put University of Washington. Let's go ahead and copy our cell, and then just paste and make sure everything's functional. If not, we'll fix it. But it looks like it is working. Sally put she's going to school, so we know her institution is the University of Washington. It looks like Jane in Charlotte has no response, so she has no institution. Yep, and that's correct. So everything's hooked up right, and everything's as it should be. We have institutions, which are going to be important because it's going to narrow our location information. Notice that some of these folks are from the same location. We've got a couple in Charlotte, a couple in Raleigh. My institution's in North Carolina. But they're at different places. Now, if we were just using the city and state, that means that they're going to stack in the same place, and you won't be able to see all of them, right? They're all going to be stacking up. It won't matter too much for a heat map, but for a location map, it would matter. This institution information, that's going to give us much more fine-grained data. So we'll be able to see, okay, both these people are in Raleigh, but they're actually not in the same exact place, right? One person's in Department of Health and Human Services, and one person is actually going to NC State. Folks who have no response, the best we can do is their city and state, because we don't want their home address, of course. So that's the best we can do. All right, so that's that, and that's how you do an if-then. These look scary because it's got all this, well, you know, you have to make sure you use the correct punctuation. You know, things have to be in the correct order. The good news is it walks you through it, and if there is a mistake, as we saw, it won't accept it. It'll tell you, hey, there's a problem here. All right, so that's institution. We want to do the same kind of thing for industry because, again, it's pulling from different places. There's one additional wrinkle in that instead of saying, hey, if you have this answer, pull from here, and if you have another answer, pull from here, what we're going to be doing is saying, if you work, please tell us the industry. But if you are going to school, we are just going to automatically insert that you're in graduate education. It's similar to what we're doing here in the industry data. It's just that there we manually knew that the person is in graduate education. Here, we're just going to tell the system. If they say that they're going to school, then just insert graduate education. So we can walk through putting in that function again, or for the first time, it looks very similar to the one we've already done. If raw responses G2, because we're actually, this is still looking at that same answer, whether they're going to school or working. If that answer is I am working, then please go ahead and insert whatever is in raw responses. Cell I2. That's the column where they put their industry. They select their industry from that multiple choice. Now we're nesting another if, because again, this is if the person replied that he or she is going to school. Raw responses, B2, if the answer to that happens to be I am furthering my education. And again, you don't have to type these out. We could just copy this cell from our previous one and then just make the changes up here. I'm just walking through this so that it's explicit what's happening. So if the person's answer is I'm furthering my education, we're not pulling from a cell. We are just going to explicitly state graduate education. So you see the difference there? Instead of telling the system, if the person's answer is I'm furthering my education, go ahead and pull from another column, we're just saying if the person responded that he or she is furthering her or his education, then go ahead and insert graduate education, that text string. And then we know that if they didn't answer either of these and they had to have answered no response, then we're just going to close that out. A couple of close quotation marks. Close the parentheticals. And there you can see when we hit return, it's working. Bill, who is working, selected business and marketing as his industry. Now let's go ahead and copy and paste this cell and make sure that the folks who are going to school, like Sally, that this automatically inserts that those people's industries are higher graduate education. I'm sorry. And there we go. It's working out. Graduate education, graduate education. It doesn't just fill the blanks because we know that Jane and Peter have entered no response, so they are not either working or going to graduate school. Or they just didn't want to reply. I don't want to pigeonhole Peter and Jane. Okay, so there we go. That's it. It's not so scary to work with seemingly frightening looking conditional statements. And we've got all our data nice and appropriately formatted in an individual worksheet here. And if we go ahead and copy and paste this, all the way down to the bottom of the worksheet, now anytime new data comes in, it's just going to automatically pull it from the raw responses worksheet and go ahead and put it here. All right, so that's that. One other thing I did want to do here is I want to insert another column here, and it's going to handle latitude and longitude coordinates. Let me sort of explain why. Let's go ahead and pull up Google Maps. This is the new Google Maps. If you've used Google Maps before, the interface might look different. And it's not just the interface, it's the actual engine. So there are some quirks, but we're just going to look at the new one because that's what the default is now. I'm going to click My Maps here, and I've got a bunch of maps, but I'm going to add a new one by clicking Create. And we get the sort of default look at the United States here. Maps function with layers. You can see right now I've got an untitled layer. It gives you one by default because you're obviously going to be adding stuff to this. And you can have multiple layers. We're going to be looking at just single layers, but you can break up things into multiple layers. There's reasons why you may want to do that. I tend to recommend people don't do that unless necessary because the free map service only allows a certain number of layers. I think it's 5 or so. So if you do it by year, layers by year, you run out pretty quick. And you can group data together within a layer. And so I usually recommend folks do that because then you're not going to hit a layer limit. You can see it gives us this helpful import option here. Add places to this layer by drawing or importing data. We're going to go ahead and click that because that's where our data comes from. Now notice we've got the option to use a CSV or an Excel spreadsheet or whatever, or we can just pull from Google Drive directly. That's what I'm going to do. And remember, as I mentioned, it's going to be looking at the first sheet. Let's see what happens if we move this sheet, map data, out of that position. So industry data is the first one. Let's see if it's smart enough to find that. So this is my worksheet, or my workbook, I'm sorry. See, it didn't pull the right one. It's only got industry and count because that's those are the columns in this first sheet. See, that's just something to be aware of, that it's not quite smart enough to do that. So let's cancel that out. If that happens to you, now we know, okay, we have to have this worksheet all the way to the left because it's only going to be looking at the first one. Now, let's make sure that's saved. Okay. Now let's import. Okay, now you see how it's pulled up all of those columns because it's looking at the right worksheet. And this is just an example because we want to add that, we want to add coordinates, because if we don't, it's going to ask us here, which column has your location data? Where do you want us to put the place marks? So right now, all we've got is cities and states. We do have this institution data, which would help us focus, but it only allows you to use one column, right? It says such as addresses or latitude longitude pairs, but we only have this one column of cities and states. We could, in theory, just mix these columns, institution and location, but we don't really want to do that because we want to keep that data separate for other purposes. So if I put location, it'll pull up the cities and states. And here it asks what you want to title each marker. I'm going to use people's names because it's just first name. What that means is when I click on a place mark, it's going to provide their name, right? Josie or Bill. Now, what we can see here is it's put all the place marks, but it only had city and state to work with. So those Raleigh folks, they're all compiled right here, right? It only pulls up one because the other person is hidden. That's why we want to have coordinate data. It's so much more, and I'm going to delete this. It's so much more precise, right? So we want to have coordinate data. And there's another reason why we want to have latitude and longitude, and it has to do with the heat map we'll be producing. We'll talk about this a bit later, but heat maps, basically, when you're using fusion tables, they need latitude and longitude. The reason why is if you ask Google to, compile or to generate the place mark data itself, to generate the latitude and longitude, it won't let you publish that. And the reason why is because it's going to be asking the server for that data too frequently, basically. It literally won't let you publish a heat map that just has cities and states or something like that, because it demands the server do that conversion on the fly, and it doesn't allow for that. So you need latitude and longitude coordinates. So let's go ahead and do that. What I'm going to do is insert a column. I'm just going to insert one to the left, and I'm going to call this coordinates. And this is where I'm going to put my latitude and longitude data. Thankfully, there are lots of services online that will take institutions or places and cities and states or countries or whatever, and they will boil those down into coordinate pairs for us. You can just Google for bulk latitude longitude finder, and let's just look at this first one, batch geocode. Yeah, this will do it for us. I'm going to go ahead and just copy this data just right from the spreadsheet. Plop that into input. It doesn't look pretty, but I bet you it's going to work. And now, depending on what service you use, there are going to be some different options. So let's go ahead and take a look. Include failed geocodes. Yeah, actually, let's not, because if there's a failure, we want to correct it. Include header row. No, we don't want a header row because all we want is those coordinates. Delimiter is comma. Yeah, that's perfectly fine. Format, degree. Yeah, so that's correct. The output fields, address in. No, we don't want the address. We just want latitude and longitude. So let's uncheck that. That looks good. Let's click geocode and see what happens. Okay, boom. So we're getting pairs, and it looks like there were no failures because it would tell us. There we go. There are pairs of latitude and longitude. And it is important to know the order because it can handle either lat and then long or the other direction. You just have to know which is which. So I'm just going to select all, copy, go back here, and just plop that in. Now we have our coordinate pairs. Okay, so now let's go back to our map. Make sure that's saved up. Let's import that spreadsheet now. Okay, and now instead of clicking location, and notice it does let you select more than one, and you can select institution data, although it's fuzzy. That can help you spread out the place markers to make them a little more precise, but it doesn't always work. So I really recommend just take the extra step, do the lat longitude, because then it'll also take care of the heat map issue. And now just select this one column, coordinates. It's smart enough to know, hey, those are lat and longitude, aren't they? And it just asks the order. We know it's latitude, longitude, so click that. We want to use name for the title of our markers. Okay, now you'll notice, see how there's a lot more of these place markers down here? That's because they've parsed those out much more finely. So now our two folks who are in Raleigh and shared that place mark, because it was stacked one on top of each other, now we can see, hey, they're actually kind of far apart. One's in the center of Raleigh, one's out west. And places that had multiple place markers before, like Charlotte, same kind of deal. All right, so now we've got the default. We've got our place markers in here. However, this is not terribly communicative. I mean, it is helpful that we now have all these spread out and we have a sort of sense of the range. We get our data here, and we'll look at that in just a second. But one thing we probably want to do is categorize these different place markers. Notice that right now it says uniform style. We want to put that into different categories that gives the viewer more data at a glance. Right now it's using uniform style, so they all look the same, right? We could change that place marker here just by clicking, and then this thing that looks like a paint bucket. So we could change that to just a dot. I tend to prefer that because then the, it has an actual circumference. Those place mark, that thing, I find it a little imprecise. And we can change the color, but notice it changes uniformly. What we actually want to do is click this thing that looks like a paint roller, and it says group places by what? And it'll give us the other columns. So say, for example, we wanted to group it by graduation year. We can do that. And it gives us the ranges option. What that means is if that was a range of numbers, something like a ranking or something like that, you can break it into ranges, or you can just use categories, so the unique values that appear. That's what we want to do because these are all unique years. It gave us this weird pastel, so I want to go ahead and make these look very separate. So I'm going to go ahead and just click on each category's paint bucket, and I'll just use colors that are quite far apart. Okay, now you can see at a glance, and click at a glance, the different years. We could do that by industry rather than graduation year. Now we know at a glance who's going to grad school, who's in business and marketing, and so forth and so on. And then who has no value, right? Appropriately, that's white. These are folks who gave us no response. and we can see at a glance who those folks are and where they're clustered. So there's our map. You can pretty much stop here if you want. We can do a little bit more tweaking. For example, on the info window, it has some information that we may or may not really be interested in. For example, coordinates. We don't really care about that. We can actually edit these en masse just by clicking edit in any one of them. And then notice it has a checkbox next to each sort of category. I'm going to uncheck coordinates because it already has a location and institution. If I save that, notice now every info window has reflected that change. Otherwise, let's see, we've got name, institution, location, graduation year. Yeah, those are all relevant. So I'm going to leave those. And basically, my map's good to go. I can now share this map. I can print it out as well. Yeah. So basically, we've got what we want here. I'm going to change my base map just to something that provides. Oh, no, not that. Yeah, probably that. This is going to draw attention to the place marks a little bit better, but I do want state lines. Yeah, probably this one. Yeah, and I would add a title and description, and then here's my shareable link. We can also embed it as well. Whoops, I didn't make it public. Right, so now I have my shareable map. I can also embed this on, say, my department's homepage or whatever, just with embed on my site. It'll give you a little snippet of iframe code to use. We can print from here as well. We can print as an image or a PDF. I tend to use PDF because I'm pretty sure it renders it out as a vector if you use PDF. I actually haven't checked that to verify it. I don't know if it rasterizes it or not. Preferably, it would keep it as a vector. It may rasterize it. Don't quote me on whether or not it does. Anywho, so that's, if we want to use Google Maps, there we go. We're pretty much good to go. And you know, it has a lot of potency and flexibility. So there's, you know, this is a really great option. I did want us to look at producing a heat map using fusion tables, just because that's another format, another kind of visualization we can do that presents the data differently. It gives us an actual different thing, right? Because here what we're looking at, it's sort of rich sites. A heat map gives us this large scale notion of geographically who's being served or where the data is anyway. So I'm going to close this out. Okay, so now fusion tables. At this point, Fusion Tables is still technically a beta, so when you go to New here in your Google Drive, it's probably not going to be listed under More. It just won't be there. All you have to do is go to Connect More Apps, that plus at the bottom, and then just look for Fusion Tables. And it'll be there, and it's from Google. They make it. It's not, you don't have to worry about a third party or anything. It's just not in Drive by default because they're still kind of tinkering. Well, gosh, they tinker with everything, but they're still, I guess, explicitly tinkering with that. Once it's added, you can just go here to More and Google Fusion Tables. Now, here again, just like Maps, you can go to Google Spreadsheets and automatically import this. The issue is if you do that, it's going to make a Fusion table for every sheet in that workbook. That's a little unnecessary, right? That's a little messy. What I'm going to do is go back to my worksheet, and I'm going to spit this out as a CSV, a comma separated value, because that's only going to be one worksheet, right? I mean, I don't need to deal with these others. I just need this. So I'm going to go ahead and do File, Download As, CSV. Okay, so it's automatically downloaded that for me. So now I'm going to upload the CSV I just downloaded. It's going to ask for the separator. It is a comma. Column names are in what row? It's row 1. Most of the defaults here, you can just click next. I'm going to talk about them, but you don't really have to tinker with this. The name of the table, it's going to get that from whatever you uploaded, but you can change that. Allow it to be exported. It's clicked by default. Other people will be able to, if you give them permission, see and export it if this is checked. You may want to uncheck that. I mean, ultimately, if we're producing a visualization and you don't want people to have access to the data itself, then go ahead and unclick that. Although they're not going to get access to the table anyway. Attribution, so who produced this? Put your own name. Whoops. Or you could put something like, program. This isn't a big deal because it's one line, it's 1 or 2 lines. It doesn't really show up much. And then a page link that's attached to attribution. So I'm going to go ahead and put my department's link there, and then a description. We'll call this outgoing student map or whatever. Let me show you where that kind of stuff shows up. You can see up here where it's attributed to UNCW English Department, and it's got a link to whatever I inputted there. That's pretty much it. Here's the description and the title. So it's not really a big deal. If you want to just keep hitting next, you can. Everything will be perfectly fine. All right, now, since we have coordinates, the Fusion table is smart enough to know what those are, and it'll map them automatically here under this tab. You can see it's made this visualization already, and it looks kind of similar to that first Google map we made where it puts everything in a uniform format. Here it's got this little, red dot. And, if we wanted to, we can share this just by clicking publish. Okay, and we don't want the table made public just yet. If we share this without it being made public, it'll say that it's not reachable. So we do have to change our visibility here. Public. Now when we publish, you'll notice we can go to the same place and it actually pulls it up. So you do have to make that public, but it walks you through the steps of doing it. One thing to point out, this is not a Google map. It looks just like it, right? That's because it uses the same backend. But this is not a Google map. It doesn't have the selection. It doesn't fall under the map section of Google. It's technically just the geographical visualization. It's not a map. So it has advantages and disadvantages. It's not findable the same way a Google map is, but it has full screen. We can handle our data here in a lot more sophisticated way, as we'll see. But it's not a map, so it's good to be aware of that. It also gives you these different options, such as you can make your own standalone website right here. I mean, that's the code right there. You just have to copy and paste it. You can even publish that a separate HTML page to your Google Drive itself, and that'll be a HTML page using your Google Drive as a server. So it can be a standalone page there. Probably for something like this, you'd be embedding it on your department's website or something like that. So it's probably not what you're looking for, but the option is there. This feature map, it looks a whole lot like Google Maps. You can change the styling of the place marks in a pretty sophisticated way. One thing about this is, by default, you can change the uniform icon. You can change to different columns. The way it wants you to do it in a Fusion table is to set up a separate column with the name of the place mark you want to use. So if I were to do this for real, I would actually fuse a separate table into my existing one that adds those place mark names based on whatever I wanted to use. So if I wanted to use industry, I'd fuse in another table that would automatically find, business and marketing, and then add a specific place mark to that. We're not going to walk through that because, to be quite frank, I mean, the output here is very similar to what you get from Google Maps. So it's something we can do, but it's a little deeper than we want to deal with right now. It's not a big deal, though. We can also cheat this, oddly enough, by going to this one called buckets, and it'll ask divide into buckets based on what. We're going to use the column graduation year and just click use this range. So that what it wants to do is set up sort of different spectrums. So it's asking for data that falls along a much greater spectrum. Since ours are just discrete years, we can just divide it into the same number of buckets as we have years, which is what? I think it's 4. Yeah. So we use 5 buckets. No, excuse me. It is 4. 4 buckets. And notice then what it's basically doing is it wants a range, right, between 2010 or 2011 to show up as yellow, but we've only got, 2011 that will show up in that range. Hopefully that makes sense. Basically, all we're doing is kind of cheating, how to separate these out by year. You can see if I apply that, now these are color-coded by year. So if that's something you're interested in doing, it has the capacity to do it. Another thing to look at, and this is actually, I think something that is an advantage of using a fusion table over Google Maps, is you can really change the info window on a much more fine-grained level. Notice, like Google Maps, you can just sort of check and uncheck these large groups. So I don't need coordinates. I'm going to uncheck industry. I don't really need that. But here under custom, you can see what we're getting here is actual code. It's just basically CSS code. Here under custom, we can change this. I'm going to save it and show you what I mean. See how in the info window, and this was true in the Google Map as well, see how it lists the category? It says institution, cherry marketing, location, graduation year, industry. That's a little superfluous. I mean, I understand what those things are. We can pretty easily just get rid of those here by clicking on change info window. So I went ahead and unchecked those large categories, coordinates, and industry. Here under custom, I'm just going to get rid of those labels. If you know a bit about CSS code, this is just B is for bold, right? And so it has automatically that label, and then it has in these brackets a variable. So institution, it's pulling from that column. I'm just going to get rid of these bold labels and just leave the variables there. Oops, a little too much zeal. And you can see it's got line breaks after each one except the last one, and then it's closing that div. So let's save. Now let's take a look. See, it's removed those category labels. So it has where the person works, city and state, person's name, and year. I don't like that order. I want the person's name to come first. And you know what? I want it to pop a little bit more. So I'm going to change that styling again. Here under custom, I'm going to change the order. Put name up top, then the graduation year, then the institution and the location. And I have to add a line break here, and I'll remove it there. I'm going to make name larger, so I'm going to change font size. I'll make it 1 larger than standard. Font size, and we'll close out the font here. Let's save that and take a look. Okay, better. It's larger. I'm going to make that bold to make it pop even more. And I want it spatially separated, so instead of doing a line break, I am going to put that inside of a paragraph. And we'll make this bold. Really, you should be using the strong tag, but I just want it to be consistent. Let's see. Paragraph. Okay, there we go. So we've got, it's bold, it's physically separated, and it's in the order I wanted. Name, graduation year. Okay, so that's something we can do. And again, it's already been published, so let me just remind myself of that URL. There we go. We've got our interactive visualization. Again, not exactly a map in terms of, it's not a Google map. I mean, it is a map, but it's not a Google map. So that's how we handle feature maps. We do have the option, we can just click on heat map here, and notice what happens. It automatically changes. It gives us only a couple of options here. We're not going to deal with weighting because that has to do with how much something counts. Each one is counting equally for our purposes. You can tinker with the radius, so how big you'd like this to be, and I might move that up. Let's put this at, say, 20, because that's really going to demonstrate where the hot spots are, right? Mostly in this sort of central North Carolina, then a little bit over here in California. Opacity, we're not going to tinker with that, but that, of course, is how, well, opaque or translucent. Yeah, that really should be called translucency. Well, whatever. Oopsie. Okay. And that we can share as well. Now, it's not interactive in the same way because individual sites don't contain that sort of rich data. Now, I did mention the use of coordinates and how it was important to have coordinates here. Let me show you this really quick. Now that we've got this published and we can see how this works, and this can be a really useful tool for internal purposes, a heat map, something like that. Let me show you this really quickly. Let's go ahead and close this out because I want to make this sort of clear. Let's delete this coordinates column. Or you know what? Instead of deleting it from our source, let's open up that CSV just so I can show you this without changing what's actually there. And let's delete this column from our CSV. Oh, wait, did I say that in the wrong format? Yeah, let's just call this updated. Oops. Okay, no, it was fine. I just want to make sure. I thought I may have saved it in Excel, which we could use anyway. But so now we've got the same data basically, but whoops, wrong one. Nope, too many tabs. But now what we want to do is look what happens when we try and use that without coordinates. So I'm going to make a new fusion table, and you can see here. Yeah, it's already. This is the fusion table we've already built. I'm going to make a new one. And I'm going to upload from there, comma. And yeah, that's fine. And we're just going to click finish because this is just for example purposes. Now notice it didn't automatically map, right? It doesn't have those coordinates, so it doesn't know what's there. What we can do is click add map, but notice that it says, okay, but I don't know what you want here, right? Let's remove that. What we actually have to do is tell it where the location data is. So I'm going to click on this column change its type from text to location. Now it's going to go through and map those out. Notice it says column type changes in process. And now it's finished. Now see, it has to geocode these automatically. We can add hints as well, but there's a big catch to this. So everything looks pretty much the same, right? Even the heat map. But if we try and publish this, notice it says heat maps for geocoded addresses cannot be published. You know, even if I make this public, there just is no way to publish this. It'll keep saying you can't do it. That's because anytime it has to automatically geocode those addresses, like that sort of thing it went through, it asks Google servers to do that. And there's a finite number of times individuals are allowed to pull the server to do that. So it doesn't let you use heat maps. It won't publish a heat map unless you provide those longitude coordinates. Okay, so all that's just to demonstrate why you do want those coordinates. It's just one extra step, and then you've got increased precision, and it takes care of those kinds of problems. All right, this has been going on forever, so hopefully you got something out of this. You know, a couple of things to be aware of using those functions for conditionals. It's not that big of a deal. You just sort of have to walk through. And again, this worksheet is shared, so you can just copy it or take a closer look at it anytime you want. Sort of the importance of adding coordinates. It's one extra step, and it takes care of a lot of problems for you. And then moving this stuff either into Google Maps, which is perfectly fine. You can get a great visualization there. But if you want something like a heat map, then you want to go ahead and use the fusion tables to provide that. Okay, so that's all I've got. If you have questions about this, please feel free to contact me using the information on my homepage, jtyrrell.com. Thanks again, and we've got one more visualization about social network mapping. I'll see you then.